got Allan here. He's going to entertain us for the next 55 minutes.
Oh, God.
As you can see, there might be a magician's act coming on here. I kind of like this. All right, just again, want to shout out to our sponsors here. For those that are new, Critical Stack and Veil Mail. Can't do it without them. Amazon, BlackBerry, the National Security Agency, Silence, Microsoft, Robinhood, Secure Code Warrior, and Paranoids. Again, from a sponsorship perspective, we can't do it without them. If you want to sponsor, please feel free to talk to somebody, and we'll definitely get you on board. And we also have events that are over there at the hotel next door. Make sure you're going there. With no further ado, the amazing Allan.
Not even a little further ado. All right, so this is an image that my wife made for me last year. It's water on the floor now. That I just wanted to put up while I give you some background here, which is software bill of materials is not a new idea. In fact, academically, we've seen it going back into the mid-90s. But it's also one of those great stories where some of those pesky security activists got involved in Washington a couple of years ago and started poking and suggesting, and it went out there. It just got out into the world by these pesky security activists. And then there was some pushback, time wasn't ripe, but eventually we managed to sort of start this ball rolling. And so it really, all this work comes because of the hard work of folks in the Cavalry, in particular Josh and Bo as well. This is an idea that came there. If I can see far, it's because I've stolen my ideas from my friends and put them in a fancy government suit and made them happen in Washington, or tried to make them happen. So I'll tell you a little bit today about this crazy SBOM idea. Who is familiar with the term software bill of materials? So we're going to dive into it. It sounds like most of you are familiar with it. I'm going to give you an update on how this process that's been happening at the Department of Commerce has been going, what's going to come next. But what I'd like to do at the end is make sure that there's a chance that we can actually talk as a community around how we can continue to make progress. Because this is the sort of thing where we've got some inertia, but it's going to require a lot of buy-in. It's going to require a lot of ambassadors, people who can go out into their sector, into their corner, into their open source dev community and say, hey, this is change that we need. Because this is only going to work if we all work together. So, this is a Mercedes S-Class. Even a 2013 Mercedes S-Class is probably outside the price range of a humble government worker. But it's not why I put that on the screen. I put that on the screen because one of my favorite tweets is from Mudge, who observed that if you bought this Mercedes S-Class, your brand new car came with libtiff, one of the most vulnerable libraries out there, netcat, oh look, we can move around the network, libpcap, oh look, we can exfil whatever we want. So your brand new Mercedes, the punchline Mudge set us up for, came pre-owned. I said came pre-owned. I don't think this is on. It's not. All right. This gives you an idea of the importance of knowing, quite literally, what's under the hood. But I want to start with another motivating story as well. A lot of people think that the most important story in security last week, the one that had all the headlines, was the Capital One breach. Right? We're seeing a little more attention in Washington around protecting data, and that's great. But I'm going to push back and say there was a far more important security story last week that didn't get nearly as much attention. And I'm not talking about the fact that John McAfee is no longer in prison. Anyone know that logo? Sorry, that logo. Thank you. Look, Ma, no hands. Yes, in the back. VxWorks, made by a lovely company called Wind River. What is VxWorks? Gentleman in the back.
Real-time operating system that runs on just about everything you touch.
Just about everything you touch. Got anyone in the satellite world? Pretty much every satellite comlink uses that to run the control chain. Medical devices. Anyone in the medical device world? So a lot of that stuff. Industrial control systems. This stuff is everywhere. And very few people are aware that they have it on their systems. And that gets us to the core of what SBOM is about. So, important question, it's the middle afternoon. Should you pay attention to this talk, or is it time to get a snack? So, I'm going to talk a little bit about transparency, right? I'm not coming to this, I'm from the Department of Commerce. We're filthy capitalists. We want markets to work. So, we're not coming at this to say, hey, please do this to make the world better. No, this is about making markets function better. We're going to talk about some of the different perspectives. This is a supply chain issue. I'm going to answer the question, hey, if this is so obvious, why aren't we doing this already? I'm going to tell you about a project that a number of you I see are already involved in, that the US government has been convening. And then we're going to talk about where we can go next, and hopefully you can give us some better ideas. So, some analogies. Every piece of candy that you buy in the grocery store today has a list of ingredients. Now, if you're like me, maybe you ignore it until there's someone in your life who's got a food restriction or food allergy. And then it's really important that that data is available and accessible in a way that you can use it. So this is not something that's magical. We've dealt with this. This has been part of me. It didn't destroy the market for food. People were still able to make food, including things with all sorts of secret ingredients that we can't pronounce. The market works even better because of this. But it's not just in the consumer space. If you run a factory and you get a pallet of 50-gallon drums, each of those is going to come with what's called a safety data sheet. That's an ISO standard. It's used around the world that says, this is what's in the barrel, this is what you do if you accidentally dunk your foot in it, or you spill a bunch on some of your pesky workers. It gives you the information that you need to understand what you're putting in your factory. So it works in the commercial space as well. And in fact, the term, a software bill of materials, is based on the idea of a bill of materials, one of the oldest concepts in modern manufacturing. The notion that, hey, before you design a product, you need to list all the parts that you're going to need so you can understand what's coming into your factory when. And when you deliver a product, you give your customer a bill of materials. If you go out and buy a 10-ton diesel generator today, the person who makes that is going to give you a list of every nut and every bolt so that you can understand your maintenance costs and your responsibilities. Now, if you buy that generator today, chances are that generator is going to be connected to the internet. And that's where the transparency ends, because today we're not sharing what is the software that, by the way, is having this really important part of my resiliency plan. Right? Big generator means I'm planning to keep my dairy farm running in a power outage. So what is the risks if someone can come in and tamper with it? Are we using the freshest ingredients? Or are we using stuff that is spoiled and going to put you and yours at risk? So why don't we do this for software today? Here's one reason. Whoops, sorry. Sorry, we lost some slides. Okay, so supply chain. Part of this has to be built around the idea that this isn't just something that is one party's responsibility. Software isn't hewn out of alabaster marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands. Right? It's written by people who are, even when they're really good, a little lazy. The fundamental principle of designing software, one of them, is code reuse. We have small libraries that are used into bigger libraries, that are used into bigger still components, that are then maybe used by other manufacturers who are making things. So this is a lovely design that was designed by someone in this room because I think it really captures, hey, there's this whole flow to say, hey, it goes into this final item that we're shipping, and then it gets used by someone. And it's important to understand, if we're thinking about our supply chain for software, how everyone along that chain both has a value from understanding transparency and also needs to communicate it, has an obligation for it. So, Josh is a fan of this guy named Deming, who's one of the pioneers of thinking about supply chain. And Josh will tell you that Deming says, we look at Good supply chain management is your supplier selection. Who am I buying from? Who am I getting my stuff from? Supply selection of this person, when I get their catalog and I'm looking through, I want to have the best stuff that I buy. And then finally, how do I make sure that the stuff that is coming in is still high quality? And that's a very powerful metaphor. The community has sort of taken this and said, we're going to start with that, but we're going to actually look at 3 different perspectives. There are the folks that produce software. There are the folks that choose software. And there are the folks that operate or maintain software. Now, a couple of key points here. Going back to our supply chain issue, most of people actually are doing more than one of these, right? These are hats that we all wear. You're both selecting things and maintaining things as you move down the supply chain. So one of the things that some of the participants, and I'll dive more into the process in a little bit, but what I like about this is we've used use cases to say, what are the different approaches for producing software? And one of them is, the one that we all know and talk about, is the idea that I can monitor for vulnerabilities. If I'm writing software, what am I actually producing? Can I make sure that I'm using the best components? So dirty little secret, I don't think that many companies around the world today can honestly say for everything that they're producing in software that they know about all the vulnerabilities that are leaving their things. Certainly not on a single pane of glass. But one of the things that I love about this approach of thinking about it from a supply chain is that it's not just about the vulnerabilities. It makes it easier and cheaper to actually produce code. There have been a bunch of reports of different types of products from large global brand names. And one thing that always you see over and over again is a single product will ship with 4, 5, 7 different versions of the same goddamn library, because there was no way to think about how they were using it. So it's not just a security issue, it's an efficiency issue. It's a code bloat issue. You can better manage your code bloat. License obligations. I'm going to talk about licenses a little bit later, but this is something that you need to know about it today. And also, by the way, one of the great values for an SBOM, for a producer, is, by the way, you can give it to your customers. Today, I'm going to argue it's a market feature. Tomorrow, and I'm not saying the Department of Commerce is a fan of this, but it might be required by a regulator. We love our regulators. So, producing software, but also choosing software. So, this is not just people who buy software, but people who are selecting different open source approaches. So we use the term choose because, again, it's a big, diverse software world. And again, there are a bunch of different values that you get from tracking. So I'm happy to dive into this, and there's some documents on the web today that begin with the first draft of this. But again, I can look at 2 pieces of software and say, this one has lots of vulnerabilities, this one doesn't. You think that should enter into your calculations? Will it completely determine them? Maybe not. But it's going to start you having that conversation. One of the things we've learned is that there's a major hospital, one of the best hospitals in the world, that today already asks for an SBOM. And they'll get the SBOM from a medical device manufacturer. And maybe it will have vulnerabilities. Now, what they can't do today is say, we're going to cancel the sale, because the doctor really wants this to save lives, right? After all, this is about saving lives, it's about patient health. But what they can do is they can say, we're going to have a conversation between our security team and the product security team so that we understand exactly what are the risks that we're putting on their network. Do you think that conversation happens in a day? It does not. It can take 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters. Anyone here ship products? All right. What does it mean when you find out that your big sale is delayed by 3 quarters? That actually starts to get to your bottom line in a big way. End-of-life awareness is another thing that we don't think about enough. All of these components have certain approaches to thinking about support. And not just the famous Windows example. There are lots, when you enter the device world, there are lots of things that are built to say, oh, well, we're based on single-threaded processors. Well, what happens when we stop using single-threaded processors? Are you still going to be able to use that library? So you can start to have this conversation about the lifetime of it. And of course, there's real help for operating software. Again, vulnerabilities. You can't defend what you don't know about. If you don't know that you have VxWorks on your network, you can't begin to think about how you're going to defend it. But the other lovely approach is, hey guys, there's stuff you can do other than waiting for a patch, right? A modern organization can do network segmentation, you can tune your IDS. There's a lot of things you can say where you can say, I don't know if I'm vulnerable or not, but it's still a risk. It's still a potential threat. So I can make an intelligent decision about how I'm going to try to defend myself. So now we get to the question of why aren't we doing this? Gosh, Alan, that sounds great. Why aren't we doing this? Here's one answer. Anyone know who that is? That is Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman is a fantastic man. He has done an amazing amount for the field of software engineering, for how we understand software as a culture. For those of you who don't know, he's the founder of the Free Software Foundation. He is the GNU in GNU Linux. He created something called the GPL, the General Purpose License. The General Purpose License is an open source license that says if you use any GPL software in a project, I'm getting side-eye from the lawyer, so I'll try to be precise. If you use GPL code in a piece of software, that piece of software now falls under the GPL license. Fair?
Sure. It was
The non-lawyer lives.
It was actually side-eye at him.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, thank you. So, I don't want to badmouth Stallman. What I want to point out is that this is an incredible risk for commercial software vendors. If you're using code that's under that license, you're at a risk for basically having failed to comply with license requirements. And chances are, you may have to buy him another house, or his foundation a third retreat site. Up until a few years ago, I don't know how many American companies could honestly say that they weren't shipping any GPL software. And in fact, we know that there were major lawsuits that were settled by big tech companies even a couple years ago. I would also argue that today, we know that risk. That's something that every corporate compliance officer has built into their process. Every startup in the world, before they even think about exit, that's one of the questions that they're going to get asked. There are lots of tools that will help you look exactly for this. Some of my friends have gotten quite wealthy because they wrote those tools. This is very popular. So, it's hard is another big approach. I was just at the first conference, the Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams. It's about half CSIRT, half PSIRT. There were 3 different talks from 3 global tech giants, all about how they were trying to, just inside their company, have a single dashboard that could help them track what versions were being used where. This isn't something, especially for giant companies, that we can do at the drop of a hat. And I want to make sure that everyone acknowledges that. Change is going to take a little while. What I love about this community is we're not willing to wait forever. And so that's what I want, as you think through, think about this. But what's one of the other problems that this is hard? What company is that? That's Apache. So there's a major conglomeration of some of the 10 biggest tech companies in the world, and they decided to learn about their security processes. They want to figure out how much can we actually solve this issue of worrying about vulnerabilities. And so they said, well, let's start looking at names. What do you call this on your system? Well, these 10 companies that have been around for a long time, they've got really good security programs, inside their own companies, 5 different names. Does your product use com.sun.java or com.oracle.java? Well, to a computer, that's actually a big difference. So one of the things that we need to solve, and one of the reasons why we haven't done this already, is naming is a very hard technical problem. We've done it, we've done global naming exactly once in the entire history of the internet. It's DNS, and it requires a giant global nonprofit and tens of millions of dollars a year to maintain. So it's not something we're going to solve just like that, but we're going to make some progress. So this is starting to sound like a market failure, right? No one's asking for this because no one's providing it. No one provides it because no one asks for it. It's a classic chicken and egg problem. I am a mediocre engineer and a mediocre economist. So wearing my economist hat, when I see market failure, I say, gosh, that sounds like a role for government. I also happen to work for government, so I'm happy to step in. Because I think there is some real value that we can create here, right? Of helping to create a shared vision and helping all of us move together. So what are the traditional roles of government, right? Carrot and stick. I don't have a stick. Congress did not deign to give me any regulatory authority. And in general, right, the Commerce Department goes around saying, yay, free markets. Because in general, the country's done pretty well by them. So we don't regulate. We sometimes work with our friends the regulators, but we don't regulate. And no one bothered to give me any money at all, or a staff. So I can't pay people to do things. So if I can't beat people into submission, and I can't bribe people into submission, what's the tool that we have? We've got this lovely term of the multi-stakeholder model. And if you kind of roll your eyes at this slide, I'm the guy who has to say this like 18 times a day, but I think there's some real value here. The vision behind the multi-stakeholder model is that we bring the right people to the room and say, we don't care what the solution is, but we're all going to be better off if there is a solution. And as conveners, we can help you identify that and move forward together. Now, anyone who's been involved in any government process, or indeed any standards process, knows that this isn't always easy. Because the solution really ought to be, no, we should do what I want. But the problem is when you have a room full of very smart people who all want slightly different things, you got to do a little compromise. The analogy I like is getting a bunch of kids into the pool. Right? No one wants to be the first person to jump into the pool. So again, traditional role of government, we can bribe people to get in the pool. We can run around and shove kids into the pool. Or we can say, hey, let's all hold hands, count, and jump together. So that is our kumbaya message of how we're doing it. What are we not doing? This is where, this is my CYA slide. This is not regulation. Happy to talk about some of the regulators waiting in the wings. This is not source code disclosure. The United States Department of Commerce does not believe in mandatory source code disclosure. And it's not a standards development process. Standards are the domain of my commerce colleagues at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, and they do great work. This is not a standards process. So, some text that stakeholders have already developed. We've got the problem. Supply chains are large, they're complex. One of the ways that we can get a handle around it is understanding the composition. A solution can help, transparency can really help. As I talked about, getting to the core of what are the issues, what are the vulnerabilities, what do we know about suspicious software, thinking about all of the benefits that I've just talked about. The goals for our process start out by saying harmonize. Let's find out what we're doing already and make sure that we're on the same page. Let's amplify what works and make it a routine. If I have any fans of the theory of the firm, organizations exist to turn complex thought into simple action. And so the goal is to say, let's make this less of this big deal and make it something that just is ordinary. Because at the end of the day, this is something that really should be built into our muscle memory of how we make software, how we buy software, how we use software. And then, of course, we want to extend it and foster innovation. Think back to CVE, right? All CVE is a way of numbering vulnerabilities. Think about how many of those companies out on the Black Hat Expo floor have a product that is dependent on that shared vision, the fact that we all use the same language to talk about vulnerabilities. Our vision is to say, let's carry it a step further and think about components. So, we've made some progress. We started last summer. A year is pretty short in government time, and we've made some pretty amazing progress. Like, this used to be a revolutionary idea. I have a hunch that far fewer of you would have understood my t-shirt even a year ago. SBOM is not a new term for many of you, and I'm really happy about that. Where have we made progress? We're focusing on, to use one of my favorite terms from Josh, crawl, walk, run. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's focus on the basics. And also, let's make sure that what we're setting up for an automatable solution. So, there are 4 different tracks inside this. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of what they are. It's the what, the why, the how, and then screw it, let's do it live. So, what is an SBOM? Turns out this was actually a little bit of a challenge. A whole bunch of smart people got into a room, and when it came down to actually whiteboarding what it was, realized, oh, we kind of have a vague vision, but we need to figure out which edge cases we're looking at, which ones we're ignoring. And so at its core, we wanted to start with the basics. At its core, an SBOM is about a software component. Right? So here is a unit of software. You say, what is a unit of software? Well, it has an identity. And the goal here is to make sure that when I say I'm using this component, it can be sufficiently uniquely identifiable. So we talk about supplier, we talk about component name, we talk about version number, of course. Hash is really helpful because now I can validate that I'm using one from an approved repo. It's not some random thing that I downloaded that maybe got backdoored. At the beginning, we don't have to use all of them because that's not going to be perfect. Remember I talked about names? Also, hashes are tricky, right? If I download a piece of software and maybe my organization has a thing where I put in a couple comments saying downloaded and entered in the repo by Allan Friedman. Well, maybe I've changed the hash now. So we're still going to have an evolutionary process to make sure that we can identify them. But at its core, again, still a component that I can label. It's a component in a relationship. So what's the core here? The relationship is X includes Y. There are a lot of different relationships that we may want to ultimately get to. The benefit of starting with include is now we're sort of freed from that very both overspecified and underspecified term of depends on. Includes is top down, so it's one directional down our graph. And it allows us to be very specific because even if you don't use the code, it's still present. And so that's why saying we're using the act of inclusion because that's about the attack surface that we're focusing on. One real question is, how many levels deep do I go in my tree? Ideally, we want all the turtles all the way down. I had one person say, I want to know what's in my device down to the sand. It's a lovely vision. It's a lovely vision. I don't think we're going to get there yet. And in fact, if you insist on a very deep, complete SBOM from the start, you're going to impose a very high cost on early adopters. You're going to get a lot of pushback. So rather than going to all the turtles, our vision is to look at from a recursive perspective. A minimum viable SBOM has my top level includes. Now, if each of my upstream suppliers has a minimum viable SBOM, it will have their top level includes. And so we can recurse our way down. The other thing we want to do is be clear about opacity. Draw a distinction between this has no inclusions versus, oh, because it's important to know whether you are at the top of a potentially dark tree or you know for a fact that you're at a leaf in your tree. Because now you can make a risk decision based on your tolerance. You can say, oh, well, I can see that this component that I don't know anything about is an operating system. I can go and get it from here. Or, yeah, I trust it. It's fine. It comes from this community, and I know they do a good job. So I can put my attention, my scarce resources, someplace else. So that's the what. Believe it or not, that actually took 9 months to come up with that basics. And there's still some more details working around that we're going to talk about who does what exactly. So for example, where do you sign things if we want more integrity in this? We're still working those out. Ideally, we'll have drafts by September 1st, September 5th, which is coming up awful soon. So why should we do it? We've got the what's, why. I've already walked you through those 3 perspectives. Those came out of this working group that did a great job actually interviewing people across the ecosystem. And I shamelessly stole this slide from that working group because I think they want to say, hey, how are we using it? What works today? What could work? And what probably won't work? And I think there's some real value there to sort of say that all of this is based on both very real perspectives. We have anecdotal data, right? It's still qualitative. They were actually fairly structured interviews. And they have that perspective from these 3 different roles. So we can carry this to anyone in the supply chain and say, hey, whatever your role is, there's some benefits for you. So we got the what, we got the why. How do we SBOM? Remember, I am not a standards development organization. So the goal here isn't to create something new. The good news is that we have at least one standard that can do this today. The bad news is that we have 2 standards that can do this today. Remember, at its core, an SBOM is about describing a component and its relationships. Turns out, lots of other things need this too. And in particular, licensing is about identifying precisely a component of software and how it relates to other things. And there are 2 standards out there in the world that do this today. One is called SPDX, Software Package Data Exchange. It's developed by the Linux Foundation. It was developed to keep track of licenses, because even open source people kind of hate Stallman sometimes. I joke, but I think there is a real need to track what you're using, right? You've got a nice little project, someone commits some code, it's under a different license, what do you do? I like the analogy that the open source community is sort of like the dog that caught the car. They suddenly woke up and realized, oh, we won the software world, but now everyone is starting to worry about the quality of their underlying code, and we don't have much in the way of formal structure that we can offer to provide the assurance further down the supply chain for communications equipment, medical devices, industrial, defense, etc. So this is something that the Linux Foundation has developed to keep track of them. We can use it for SBOM. There's also something that comes out of the commercial software world called SWID tags, software ID tags. It is the benefit of being an ISO standard, which means everyone in the commercial world can sort of look at it and say, yeah, I get it. It is the downside of being an ISO standard, where everyone in the open source world says, no way in hell am I paying 970 francs to read a piece of paper. But the good news here is there's a lot of open source details on this. This was developed by the licensing world. Imagine you're a giant global company. You've got 15,000 different Adobe products on your network. How do you keep track of which one is licensed to go where, for how long, by whom? Well, they made a nice little metadata standard built on XML that, again, talks about here's a software component, here's how it relates to other things. That's all we need to do the SBOM. So again, XML, we have the ability, we've talked about how do we make them cross and compatible. Because our goal here is to be Canada. We're going to be a bilingual world. The government's not in the business of picking winners and losers. We want to make sure that we can translate. We're aware that in different regions, there are going to be very strong proponents for one standard or the other. That's fine. We want to make sure that whatever you get your SBOM data in, you can choose to output it, again, back down that supply chain the way you want to. So, there's also a fantastic proof of concept from the healthcare world. This grew out of the first meeting that we had last summer where a bunch of people showed up, very skeptical. Oh, why are we doing this? Is this my water? Thank you. And there were people complaining, oh, we shouldn't do this. It's a waste of time. People get confused. Too much data. Roadmap to the attackers. I'll talk about some of those things later. And eventually, a couple of people from the medical device community got sick of it. They're like, this is ridiculous. We can do this today. We want to show that we can do this because we need this. Not just because a regulator has told them that they have to do it, but because they realize that having that visibility down the supply chain, especially for a blinking box that you don't want to scan, is going to be absolutely key for all the security benefits that I talked about. So they said, we're going to do it. They quickly developed, we're going to do this exercise with a set of use cases. We're going to test it against this set of use cases. We're going to share data. A handful of medical device manufacturers got together with a handful of hospitals and said, let's do this. Let's actually pull together the information on the medical device manufacturer side, share it with the hospitals, and the hospitals would use that data for these set use cases. The thing that actually took the longest was getting the lawyers to okay it. See, lawyers are usually very helpful, but every so often they slow things down a little bit. So they actually did this exercise. At the end of the day, it only took them about a month and a half when they did it live. Some really interesting preliminary lessons, because they weren't building it on all the stuff we talked about. They designed this without having this slightly standardized form. So what they found was, one, very few of the medical device manufacturers could actually do this completely automatically today. Their build processes didn't have the natural point where you could export this data. Now, it's interesting to note that if you're writing your own software and you're using GitHub, it'll do this today. There are tools, right? You're using Eclipse, you're using Visual Studios. You can actually extract this data because essentially you're running make with a couple of extra commands, a couple of extra flags to pull out the data. The more complex your build chain is, and the more different ecosystems, right? If you're not just pulling everything from Node, it gets a little more complicated. Not impossible, but a little more complicated. Similarly, so everyone was able to do it, just took them a little bit. And that's helped organizations learn how they can make it easier, faster, cheaper to do it. It's going to be a learning process. Similarly, the hospitals today, they pulled the data in, and they said, yes, every single use case they were at least able to partly succeed. Was it turnkey? No. Why? Because we don't have the tools that are built to do this today. So there's still some issues with naming. Again, if you're looking for vulnerabilities, you have your vulnerability source, right? CVE list, your National Vulnerability Database, and you've got your list of components. So you need to make sure you can do that mapping. If the name's a little different, you're going to have a bad time. And by the way, if you try to use some fuzzy mapping, then you're going to have way overmatching. So it's going to be equally problematic. So two things that we learned from this proof of concept. One, we can do it today. Two, we need to learn how to do it better today. And the folks involved were so enthusiastic that they've already resolved to say, we're going to do another proof of concept. We want to learn from our mistakes. Let's iterate. This is classic experimentation, guys. This is science. You try it, you test it, you see what works, you see what doesn't, you try it again. So I'm really happy with the progress that's been made. There's still a lot of open questions. There's still things that we're trying to figure out at the basic level, and some more things at the advanced level. So one thing that we don't really know is, in general, what are the obstacles to getting this data? In some environments, it's going to be pretty easy, right? In Node, everything's already there, right? If you have a package manager, well, that's the whole point of a package manager. It helps keep things together. Other areas are going to be a lot more diffuse. You're using software from different communities. There's different maintenance practices. You're using multiple different layers of technology, so you need to figure out how to place it all in one context. Today, we don't have really global visibility of what that landscape looks like. Where are the valleys where it's nice and easy, where are the peaks where it's really hard. That's something we're going to have to learn by experience. That's where we need ambassadors. We don't have a clean idea of what the active transparency looks like. I've talked about what vendors need to do to generate the data and the benefits. I've talked about how it can help customers, people who are using the data. the act of transparency gets a little tricky sometimes. So in some cases, it's going to be easy. So a SWID tag is metadata that sits next to the binary. Super easy. That's lovely. But for an embedded device, well, maybe it's XML takes up a lot of room. It needs to be updated regularly whenever there's a software update. And maybe you don't really want to keep your metadata on a prod device where you don't want your scanner continuing the cycle. There are going to be communities where they're like, we'll share it internally for now. We're not comfortable making it truly public. So what is, I'm all for complete decentralization, but there are going to be areas where there are going to be communities that want to do some centralization. We're going to figure this out over time. One of the biggest stumbling blocks is the question of vulnerability versus exploitability, right? The vulnerability is the superset of all the things that you need to potentially worry about. Often, you're not going to have to worry about it, right? There are, depending on how you count them, between 600 and 1,000 function calls you can make in the OpenSSL family of libraries. How many of them are heartbleedable? 2, as I count them. So someone says, oh, I can't use this product. You're just going to give me OpenSSL old.old? Heartbleed. Well, I'm only using the random number generator. So how do we enable that kind of communication? Because if we are just doing a simple library mapping, we're going to have a very expensive process with a lot of what we might call false positives as vulnerability management. The automatic tooling starts to set up red flags. We need to find some way of making this a little more automated. So, what are the next steps? You've got this lovely little process the US government is running that anyone can join. We've had folks from big companies, we've had folks from small companies, we've got academics, we've got hackers. Anyone can join this. I'm begging you, come talk to me, we'll bring you up to speed, you can participate. This is a chance where you can actually help write the documents that the entire world is going to be using for this, we hope. So we want to have this baseline approach. We're not going to stop there, though. The goal is not just to, hey, here's a document, woo! I know that all of you regularly read the NTI website, and everyone sort of does the daily check-in with the Federal Register notice. I understand, but not everyone is quite as well informed as you are. So we need to make sure that we can take these out into the world. We want to extend the model. The baseline is essentially about keeping honest people honest. The software vendor says, I'm using this. It's like, great, this will help me understand my risks on the network. What about active intentional attacks on the supply chain? What about attempts for people to intercept the bomb so they can try to change it on the fly? What about other security issues that you're worried about? Compiler details. Are you actually using the spec that you say you are? We're going to have to think about more high assurance use cases. Tooling is the second next big important piece. If you're doing this by hand, if you're doing this in PDFs, you're doing it wrong. It's got to be automatically built, automatically consumed. Different parts of those will be easier than others. We're going to need some folks from the vulnerability management solution space. We've already talked to a couple of them. I see Tenables in the room. The goal here is to make sure that everyone understands the importance of this and can figure out how we can help customers. Right? This should be part of our balanced breakfast for thinking about vulnerability management solution. So we've got extending the model, we've got tooling, and then the final piece is awareness and adoption. This is something that is not an American project. This is a global project. It's one big internet out there. But different sectors have different needs, have different terms, have different words. We need champions who can go and take this and say, how can this fit in this small subsector? In this open source community, what's the merits that we can offer so that people can use our code? How do we make sure that we're not sort of left out of that open source software supply chain? So we're going to need a lot of champions. We're going to need some real strategy for thinking about how this happens. I don't think we can snap our fingers and have the entire world do this, but I think that we can actually make a case that very few people should be ignoring this completely. So, as I said, this is a supply chain issue. And I love this graph because the supply chain is big, it's complex, it's scary. There are lots of risks out there. SBOM is not going to solve every supply chain risk, but it is part of the complete breakfast that we need. And it is going to be, transparency is going to be part of every solution that we want to build on. So we really need your help. I think that transparency is about the lightest lift that we can ask in the industry, but we still need some people to help us move the ball along. So I'd love some of your perspectives on what we can do. I think we still have some time. And here is how to get in touch with me. I hope you come and enjoy. Yes. Do we have a roving mic somewhere? Or I'll just repeat the question if we...
So back in the day, years ago, when one was talking to an ICS vendor about different security characteristics, they'd say, "Oh, nobody's ever asked me that before," and then they'd say, "Why are you asking me that question?" Usually they're not saying that today as much. But what I wonder is, are there examples that are citable of, I'll call them early adopters, recognizing you don't want to endorse anybody, nor can you or should you, but it's just very helpful for purchasers when they're having a hard conversation with the vendor and the vendor says, "Ooh, I don't want to do that," for lots of reasons, to say, "I get it, you don't want to do that. I just want you to know vendor A, B, and C are doing stuff in this space."
That's a phenomenal question. That's the great news, is that we actually have some folks that are doing this today. So one of my favorite stories on the purchaser side of things is my friend Sunil from the Bank of America. So he's asking for this. So I'm just going to leave this. So Sunil's asking for this today. And he understands if the manufacturers can't provide it. But his perspective is, if you have a good development process, this shouldn't be a heavy lift to generate. And so if you can't do this, and again, he's only looking at enterprise financial software. It's a little different, I understand. But this should give you a fun idea for your purchasing. He knows, based on experience, that someone who doesn't have a good development process is going to cost them more to maintain. And so he will take 5 to 10% off the top of the asking price, 5 to 10% less net for any of his suppliers that can't generate an SBOM, because that's just the quality signal that he sees it as. So that's one approach, which is completely get it, can't build it, it's going to cost me more to maintain, so I need you to come down off the price. So that's happening today. There are a number of vendors that are doing this and are doing it more and more in different places. I don't want to call anyone out on camera at the moment, but Josh might be able to.
Well before it was required by medical device makers, and doing it in a not machine readable format, Philips Medical started publishing theirs, which got a bunch of more device manufacturers to say, maybe we could do this in the MDS2 forms. And concurrent with all that, one of our task force recommendations, Congress asked IATC, can you please require software bill of materials for medical technologies, which the regulator for that space is now asking for in the pre-market guidance. So what was voluntary from a couple that were doing it and providing real benefit to very large hospitals is now pursuing this in a very narrow sense in the medical device community. And because sometimes governments work together, I believe the language is something like, if Allan's process produces something useful in time, they'll use it. So, but yeah, Philips started this voluntarily, and now we're trying to harmonize how each of them do it.
And that's been great. Is there another question in the back? Yes. Aha. I feel like walking through the cabaret tables is very appropriate in this jacket.
So government organizations have been doing this. DISA has done this for protecting DoD computers. NSA has done this for Intel. US CERT has done this for critical infrastructure. Have any of them published any of their standards, or would they contribute anything that would help kick this off? Because we've been doing this for a long time.
So I would love to chat more with you on that. I hadn't heard about the US cert side of things. Have had a lot of conversations with some DISA folks. And usually it's framed in the upcoming proposed regulation that, by the way, we need to see the passport of everyone who's ever touched any of the code that your sub is using.
Right.
That's going to break software. What I like about the SBOM, and what I have not heard, and I've had a lot of conversations with the senior folks at DISA, maybe I need to go down into the ranks, is making them appreciate, you know, you don't need to know everything about it. What you need to do is know all of the components and then set up the appropriate surveillance of the open source libraries. Because frankly, if there's a stable library like LeftPad that, you know, has only been touched by the same 6 people once a month for 2 years, and then gets a bunch of commits from behind a Tor node, that should set off alarm bells. And the best way to do that, in my mind, is to centralize the data and empower the world's best counterintelligence organization to actually focus on it, rather than having this bespoke, decentralized way that, at best, is going to quadruple the price of taxpayer-funded software, and at worst is going to lead to a lot of people lying to the government and breaking software. But let's follow up after this.
Sure.
Thank you for hopping in.
Where can I get that shirt?
I'll post a link to the design. It turns out there's no government ethics rule against making your own shirt, so I just decided to make one to encourage it. If someone wants to go and make them and sell them, hey, that's the joy of government-based IP.
So if you're using software projects that you yourself have patched or pulled out of tree patches or modified substantially, how do you deal with that? Because for long-running services, this can be, like, you can have a substantially different, built off of the same version, but a very different set of source.
Huge question, right? So, and there are a couple of small components. One of them is I have, you know, Allan's fork of open code library, right? I just pull it in and I change something, and now I'm responsible for naming it. That's no longer third-party code. That is you're responsible for maintaining. There's still the risk, though, right? And that's where we don't have a clear answer for that other than stop doing that. Right, and be transparent if you are, right? There are organizations that have, a lot of the big switch manufacturers, for example, have their own shadow parallel version of the large crypto libraries, where they've tweaked them to make them efficient based on their hardware, but the underlying code is the same. And so do we want to call that, you know, how's it labeled? It's not the same, but we don't have a good way to talk about it. The other thing that we don't know about, and we don't have a good response to yet, is backporting. This is one of the few good criticisms that came out of the initial wave of outrage by some in the hacker community. So I buy a piece of software, or I buy a company, it's got a lot of old software in it, and rather than just updating everything, because I've got to do a whole lot of variable refactoring, I go to the security issue that anyone would care about, and I just fix it in the source code. So it still is either version old.old, BEAS, or it's my own brand new version. Today, we don't have a good way of talking about it. There are tools that can identify it. So if someone tries to include it in their code, and one of the downstream partners is using an SCA tool, it's going to get flagged, and a responsible risk manager is going to ask some questions. Oh, I'm getting the red light that says stop. So thank you all for your time. I'm incredibly grateful. I strongly encourage you to get involved. It's going to make a world of difference.